It's Christmas time in 1917, and the gentle slush is falling everywhere. I held off on putting an earlier one up, mainly because the situation didn't change a hell of a lot. Well, that's to be expected. But also, things seemed like they were in a fluid state, and I wanted to be able to state sort of the exciting events that might have been undertaken, but they weren't actually happening. Obviously, situation in the West Front with both Italy and France calling off their offensives and the Central Powers not engaging in any stayed pretty much the same. The Swiss learned their lessons and they've kind of rebuilt their army. They're gonna relax for a while. It just doesn't do them any good to kill them off. Over on the naval front, the Germans pulled some of their air reconnaissance units off of the coast. They decided not to go forward with a naval adventure on this quarter, and I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not. They've got to do one at some point. Again, at least one more, because they did repair the ships. British took heavier losses over in the submarine warfare side, and the Germans are taking less from the blockade, but that can't continue. It just tends to favor the Allies. U.S. is still completely uninvolved in this. No interest at all in the war. That's one of the things I play for with the Centrals, is to keep them out, because once their economy starts chugging in favor of the Entente, there's no way you can knock someone like England out of the war. And the hope is, well, maybe I could knock Russia's economy out. Russia turns out to be the powerhouse in this game economically, at least the way I play it, which doesn't make sense because I'm hitting them with all the force, so I don't know. Over in Africa, von Lettow chased down the Portuguese, and he actually managed to lose a unit doing so. Which is not a good thing. And meanwhile, for him at least, the rest of the Allies have retaken English Africa and are going to move their way down towards that South African area. Like I said, that's pretty much sealed off as an avenue for the Germans to really do a lot of damage. Over in the Turkish theater, the Brits have pushed the Turks back to Damascus, and also pretty much to Mosul. The Turks really don't want to fight anymore. They're out of manpower. Also, we see the Russians are pushing into Anatolia. The Turks just do not have the strength to maintain the war, and politically they don't have the will either. At least in terms of the parliament. Over in the Balkans, nothing much has changed. A little bit of shifting to make the lines a little better for, well, really everybody concerned. It doesn't really help much, but it does reduce some of the stretching on some of the central miners. But the biggie was over on the East Front, and that's where, that's why I was holding off so long, was the German offensive was one hex from succeeding. There was a lot of thought in my mind about when it happened early, and they were only 2 hexes from succeeding after the first turn of the offensive back in June. My thought was, on the Russian side, gee, maybe a Russian major retreat would be worthwhile to avoid the big national will loss for losing an offensive. But I decided 2 hexes, that's still a lot, even though they took 4 on the first turn of the offense. I got a chance of holding them in. Let's see what happens, because the risk isn't that high. By the time it got down to 1 hex, it was really bad weather. It didn't really start snowing yet, but there's slush, there's rain, whatever. And the German army was obviously coughing its way, trying to make it to the finish line. And they made a couple of good stabs at it, either of which could have easily gotten them that hex. But the situation as it ended up, we got this little pocket here. The Russians attempted a counterattack. That was not very impressive. And they also attempted an attack over on Königsberg. And part of this is just because if they don't lose some more strength points, they have a huge reserve in the background, they're just wasting troops, so they might just kill a few Germans in the action. I was expecting maybe a shock action over in the Königsberg, where they might get it and be able to siege it over the winter, just because Germany had pulled troops off of it. It kind of knew better, but things like that actually would fit very well under the fog of war of the game. So I tend to roll a die for things like that. There's some interesting revolts going on over in Bohemia. The Austrians had to throw a bunch of troops there, a lot of good stuff. And Russia's seeing something over in Kazakhstan. Hopefully these will be cleaned up by the spring in terms of what the countries involved will be handling. Strategic bombing went downhill this time as the Centrals began to rebuild their air force, and the threat of that was enough to keep the Entente from doing attacks. On the other hand, the Germans did launch a little bit on the Russians. They managed to knock out most of the Russian Air Force. Basically, Richthofen didn't show up until now, and he's a big advantage in the game. He really makes the German air power much more potent than anybody else's. So that's a slight edge for them. On the bright side for the Central Powers, the Germans they succeeded in their war weariness test, so they haven't gone through that. I'm sort of in the middle of the interphase right now, about ready to pick certain events to decide what the different governments are doing to try to stabilize themselves, get more men, whatever. There aren't a lot of options right now. As soon as that's done, I'm going to be making some rolls, which could actually end the game, but that's highly unlikely. We got Germany and Austria with shaky national will, and also Turkey and England. So, I mean, anytime you drop below 20, there is the very slight possibility that the game's over for you. But as we saw, you can drop all the way down to that -6 area and still have a fairly good chance of succeeding. That was the other thing. Clemenceau took power in France after the big defeat, and he got canned right away. The government showed no real desire to continue the war after all, even with his leadership, so he's on the way out. And that's a really bad thing for the French. The Clemenceau event more or less says, France ain't going to surrender. Well, he's easy enough to get rid of, though. All right.